In today's video, I'm going to be showing you an app that I built that was built very, very differently from pretty much all the other apps that I built on this channel. It's a fairly powerful app, but it was built in ways you're not even going to imagine. And so I'm going to be showing you what the app is, how I build it, and how you can build very, very powerful apps using this very simple technique. Now, before we get started, as always, all the apps and all the resources that I demonstrate on this channel are going to be available from my Patreon page. And you can learn more about our amazing Patreon community via a link in the description below this video. Now, I recently discovered a very, very cool app. Okay, this app is called Summary GPT bot, and this is an AI powered text summarization Telegram bot that generates concise summaries of text, URLs, and YouTube videos. So this was very, very different from kind of what I'm used to because it's a Telegram bot. So I went on this link right here and I started to play with it, right? So this is the bot right here. And essentially what you can do is you can give it a link of a YouTube video or a like a web page URL or a PDF, and it gives you a concise summary. Okay, so here's a YouTube video that's a comparison AirPods Pro versus AirPods Max. I'm trying to decide which one is better, and this was the result. Okay, here's another video, right? Introduction to large language models. This is from Google Cloud themselves, and here was the nice summary here, right? So this app got me very, very curious because it's only one file. It's only one file. And beyond that, they're not using LangChain. They're not using OpenAI embeddings. They're not doing anything. This is just pure code. And they're able to summarize fairly large videos, right? Fairly large files, long videos, you name it. And so I was very, very curious how, was this person able to build an app without using these emergent technologies such as LangChain, embeddings, vector maps, and things like that. I was curious, how is this possible? And I also challenged myself to build a similar app such as this one using purely no code without writing a single line of code. And that is exactly what I did today. And so let me show you the app that I built. Let me show you how it works. And then we're going to jump back and I'm going to show you how I built it and why is this method so powerful and why you should be using in your own apps as well. All right, so here's my app. I built it inside of FlutterFlow, which is my favorite no-code builder right now. But I'm using another very, very powerful tool, as you're going to see in just a second. So let's go ahead and run this app right here. Let's set up a test environment. All right, so here's the app. And what you're looking at is different chats that we have. And I just called it AI chats. And you can start a new chat here, or you can go to an existing chat. So I already have a chat here. I'm just going to click here. And the way this works is that you can just paste a link and that's going to summarize it for you. Okay, so for instance, here I found an article right here called emissions are no longer following the worst case scenario. So some kind of a scientific article that I just stumbled upon, a random article. And all you have to do is copy this, go back to the app and paste it here. And the idea is once you click send, it's going to process the article and it's going to summarize. It's going to give you a concise summary of the entire article. So we're going to send it here. We're going to wait a few moments for it to summarize and process the article. All right, and there is the result. This is the concise summary of the article, right? Global CO2 emissions have been relatively flat over the last decade due to accelerating energy transition driven by the falling cost of clean energy. So you have a very, very nice concise summary of the article that was generated relatively quickly. Let's try another article right here. So here's another article called How Extreme Heat Kills You. Okay, let's copy that and let's paste that into our chat window here. We're going to send it and we're going to wait a few moments to see a nice summary of this article as well. And here's a nice concise summary of the second article. So you can kind of scan through it in order to get an idea of what the article is about. And then perhaps you can read the entire article, okay? Now, you may be asking, what is so special about summarizing these articles? Well, the first thing you have to understand is these articles are relatively long. You can't really copy and paste them into a model and get a summary, because they're going to be longer than the context window. And moreover, it doesn't really matter what the length of the article is. They could be short, they could be long. Our app is going to create a concise summary of it regardless. So we're not limited by the context window. And another thing is that just like the original app, we're not using LangChain, we are not using embeddings, we're not using any of that. We're just using pure drag and drop to build this kind of app. Now, before I show you how you can build apps that do something similar or maybe do exactly this right here, let me show you how this app works as well as how the original app works. I know many of you have had these questions in the comments, and you are going to be amazed once you see how the whole thing works. So the first thing that you have to understand about this algorithm, and this is the algorithm that this app uses, is that this is a very, very unique algorithm. And so what exactly is happening? Well, it's not using embeddings, it's not using vectors, it's not using LangChain, it's not using any of that. What exactly is it doing? Well, it's very, very intelligent when it comes to taking like a long, piece of text, like a long article, maybe even a book, and creating very, very concise summaries out of it. And the way it works is that there are several steps that happen with the text, right? So the first thing it does is it takes this text and it splits it into tokens. This is exactly what my app does as well. And what are tokens? Well, tokens could be words, they could be sentences, they could be paragraphs. It's really up to you. In the original app, they use words as tokens. In my app, I use sentences, okay, just so that we have less tokens. Once we have the tokens, the next thing we want to do is we want to split them into chunks, okay? So in the original app, you have a chunk that's 1,500 characters. That is exactly what I have as well. And what is a chunk? Well, you can have a sentence that's like maybe 20 characters or 30 characters, but a chunk is going to have many of these sentences. And so what we're looking for is we're looking to take that entire document, that entire article or book or PDF or you name it, and break it apart into chunks, because it's a lot easier to look at different chunks and summarize them than summarizing each sentence individually. So once we've broken down the whole thing into X number of chunks, what we're going to do next is we're going to summarize each of these chunks. Okay, so we have these chunks, and in fact, the articles that we've just summarized, they have somewhere around 8 to 11 chunks in that ballpark. And so what we're doing is we're summarizing individual chunks using OpenAI, using ChatGPT. And the next thing that we're doing is we're summarizing each one of these chunks. And this is the interesting part, is that when we tell ChatGPT to summarize each of these chunks, we tell it, make sure you summarize it in half the number of words. Okay, that is the first prompt that we're using. And so the end result is, we have, let's say, 10 chunks. We get back those 10 chunks, but now they're shorter. They're around half of the original number of words. They're half of the original length. And we keep repeating this process. Okay, so we take these summarized chunks, we combine them, then we break them into more chunks, and then we keep summarizing. And we basically repeat the whole process over and over until we have 5 chunks left. And so with my use cases, we had like 10 chunks that we started with, but we want to repeat the whole process until we have 5 chunks left. And once we have 5 chunks left, we have another prompt to ChatGPT where we just simply tell it, take these 5 chunks and create a concise summary out of it. And using this technique, you can summarize just about anything. You can summarize a book, you can summarize, a YouTube video, you can summarize, a document like we were doing with our app. It's a very, very powerful algorithm to summarize just about anything. And I'm sure many of you were wondering, how exactly do you summarize things without going over your token limit? Well, this is one way. This is an amazing way of doing that. Now, how exactly did I build an app that does this? Well, unlike some of the previous apps, I did not write custom code in FlutterFlow. I did not, have custom functions or widgets or anything like that. In fact, for this specific project, I used make.com. Remember, I recently had a video dedicated to make.com, and many of you were curious, how exactly do you build more complex apps? Well, for this project, I decided to use make.com instead of writing custom code with FlutterFlow. So what you're looking at right now is a scenario that essentially does what I just talked about. So you see this algorithm right here. Well, I built a scenario, which is a flow from scratch that does exactly that. Let me show you how it works. And by the way, if you're a member of our amazing Patreon community, I'm going to be giving you this scenario, and you can simply import it into make.com and start playing around with it, because it's a very, very powerful algorithm. And so what exactly is happening in this scenario? Well, it's all fairly simple. So the first thing that we have is a webhook, and that's typically how I start my scenarios in make.com, because we're going to be sending the data from FlutterFlow. So we're going to be, remember, we have that chat interface where a user enters a URL, and that is exactly what we're going to be sending to this webhook. So in this webhook, as you can see, we are sending a URL. We're just sending a URL. The next thing we have is an HTTP request module that essentially connects to that URL, but it doesn't just connect to it. Okay, we need to get the content. And for that, I'm using an amazing tool called Extractor API. Okay, and all you have to do is sign up for their very, very generous free plan, and they give you an API key, and you can simply send a URL with your API key, and you're gonna get just the raw text. There's a lot of Chrome extensions that do exactly this. I don't know if they're using this API or another API, but this is a really nice API. And so with this call here, that is exactly what I'm doing. I'm calling Extractor API using my key. You're going to have your own API key, and I'm passing the URL that I got here, okay? The next thing I'm doing is I'm setting a chunk size, okay? So a chunk size, remember we talked about chunk sizes here, right? So here we're using 1500 characters as a chunk size, and you can kind of experiment with it. I know the original app was using a chunk size of 1500 characters, and what this means is that the bigger the chunk size, the less chunks you're going to have. But you cannot have a chunk size that's more than the amount of tokens that you can fit into a chat GPT call, right? So remember that. So, they're using 1500 characters. That is kind of what I'm doing, 1500 characters. And then I'm setting my input text. So I'm taking the text that we parsed using that extractor API, and I'm splitting it by period using the split function. And that gives me an array of all the sentences, right? Because sentences are delimited with periods. So I get an array of all the sentences. The next thing I have is this iterator, right? And what this iterator does, it essentially cycles through each of the sentences, okay? And then I have a data store. And what is a data store? Well, if you come over here, right, if you click here, you have this data store. And the purpose of the data store is kind of like app state, right? In FlutterFlow, you have app state, you have page state. Well, a data store is kind of like app state. And what I'm keeping track of is I'm keeping track of the current chunk, and I'm also keeping track of all the chunks that I processed so far. So if you look at this flow right here, we have a data store, then we have a router. And what we are trying to do right here with this router is that we are creating chunks. And as soon as a chunk is, greater than or equal than 1500 characters, we add it to an array, right? So if you look at this data store, we have an array of chunks, and then we have the current chunk that we're working on right now. And so right here, we are essentially processing chunks, right? This part right here is responsible for keeping track of the current chunk, because we don't want to add a current chunk anywhere until it's greater than 1500 characters. That is exactly what we're doing. So, when it's greater than, 1500 characters, we add it to the record, to the array. And this thing adds it to the array. And then right here, once we added all the chunks to our data store, we are going to have, n amount of chunks. I think in my apps, I had like 8 chunks and then 11 chunks because the second article was longer. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to get the record, right? We have this key one, which is this key one here. And this essentially gets our record here. So we're going to get the current chunk, which is going to be empty, because we've processed all the chunks and we have an array of chunks. And once we've gotten all the chunks from the data store, right, because we process them here, we have another iterator. And the purpose here is to go one by one over all the chunks that we saved, and we want to summarize it, right? So I'm using my OpenAI module here. And what I'm doing here is that for each of the chunks, I'm setting up this prompt. I'm saying, summarize the following text using half the number of words. And so this is exactly what we talked about here, right? We have summarized chunks and we're basically dividing them by two. So if you have a chunk that's, 10 words, it's going to give us back a summary of 5 words. And so once we've processed all the chunks and everything is done, we have all the final chunks. We have this one final prompt that essentially says, please summarize the following as one block of text in the following JSON format. So I give it a JSON format, and then I give it the final chunks. I give it the final chunks, and I say, well, you have those summarized chunks. Now create me one last summary as a block of text. Okay. And I'm not saying, use, half as many words or anything like that. I'm just saying, just create me a summary from those chunks right here. And I'm also giving kind of a format of the JSON that I'm expecting. And then I have my webhook response that basically responds to the initial request that was sent here. And this initial request uses this thing here. All right. So if you click here, you can see that we are getting the response right here, right? So this is the response here. And that is what we are responding with. And so as you can see, it says here, body works to maintain internal temperature of 98 F. And this is exactly what was in our app right here. So a fairly complex scenario, but no single line of code, no custom functions, no Dart code or anything like that. And we call this scenario using our FlutterFlow app. So here's my FlutterFlow app. I'm using it as the UI. If I click on my API calls, I have this get summary where I have this URL that we got from here, right? So all these webhooks, if you click on this, you're going to be given a URL, because that's exactly what a webhook is. It's essentially a URL that you call and you pass some data into it, and it does everything else. And so if we go back to our FlutterFlow app right here, we have this URL, we have this API call that uses this URL, and we have a variable called URL because we're expecting a URL. It's a string. It's not a list. And then we have a body. And in the body, we're just crafting a very, very simple JSON, okay? This is just a JSON string here, right? We have a URL, it's a JSON. And then once we go back to the app, this is a very, very simple chat app. I just have, like 4 screens. You can ignore this screen right here. We have the chat screen. We have the chat messages. I also have the profile because we need to have the user log in. And then I also have the schema here. So if I click to Firestore, and I come here, I have my users. This is created automatically by FlutterFlow if you enable authentication. So not really much to discuss here, but these ones I created myself. We just have a simple chats collection of documents, right? And then each chat document has a sub collection called messages, and we're storing message, timestamp, and user. And on the chat collection, we're storing timestamp, last message, so we can display it on the main screen, UID, and user. And if you go to the chat screen, if you click on this card right here, you're going to be redirected to the chat's messages. If you go to chat's messages, we have our messages screen. I've used this kind of setup before. So if you've seen one of my previous videos, I'm going to link another video. I explained exactly how I have this set up. Essentially, I have a stack that displays 2 rows. And depending on who sent the message, we either display it on the right-hand side or the left-hand side. Left-hand side is for the response from the AI, and the right-hand side is what the user is sending. And so if you go over here to this send button here, you can see that we have just 6 actions. When the user presses send, we save the user's message. We call this API with the URL that the user entered, and then we check for the response. If it succeeded, we create that document, the response that we got as a document. So we have a message, timestamp, the user. The user we just set to AI, and the messages is just the summary, the response that we got back from the API, which is actually a JSON path, because that is kind of how we are sending it. We're sending it as a JSON path. And then we have a backend call that updates the main chat screen. Specifically, we are updating the last message and we're updating the timestamp. And so that we have the data not only in the messages screen, but also in the main chat screen. And then we're just clearing the text field. So from the FlutterFlow's perspective, this is just the UI, right? This is purely a UI. All the magic, all the real logic happens inside of make.com, which is extremely powerful. And I honestly couldn't believe that I was able to replicate this algorithm that was on the original app using a make.com scenario just with drag and drop. Fairly simple, and it works really well. Now remember, if you want to play around with this app, and I highly recommend to all of you, like, take a closer look, see what's happening, because there's some very powerful things that you can do. I definitely urge everyone to have a closer look on the app. And just like with all the apps that I discuss on this channel, you're gonna have access to the FlutterFlow app. So that means you can view and or clone it. And I'm also gonna include this scenario as well. I'm just gonna go in here. I'm gonna export it as a blueprint, and then you can simply import it inside of your make.com account, and you can see exactly what's happening, and you can get a better idea of how everything works. And remember, when you join our amazing Patreon community, you also get access to extra content such as Q&As, live streams, behind the scenes content, and our Patreon exclusive masterclass series where I do a deep dive on some of the topics that the community votes on. So you get a ton of content, plus you're gonna get this template plus the app, just like I do with all my apps that I built on this channel. Now, if you missed my previous video on make.com, I'm gonna link it right about here, and definitely check it out. That way you get a better idea what exactly this tool is about and how you can use it to build amazing apps.